Greetings, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland, and this video is saying Ave at Kowale to Bob Hawke. Bob Hawke, the former Prime Minister of Australia. So just in case he needed an introduction, I thought I ought to spell that out. Unfortunately, Mr. Hawke was called to the great big debating chamber in the sky a week ago. He was 89 years old. So Mr. Hawke, well, he achieved quite a lot as Prime Minister of Australia. I suppose I'll come into his career a bit later, but give a potted biography of him. So he was born in 1929 in South Australia. It's not a very populated state, had a very low population at the time. He was of a British descent, as his name would suggest. His father was a congregational minister. And when he was very little, they moved to Western Australia, where his father ran a church in a small town. So these were not propitious beginnings for someone who turned out to have high political ambitions, because Australian prime ministers until then had overwhelmingly come from Sydney or Melbourne, and there he was very much from the outback. He didn't have much of an ochre accent. So he went to university, I think it was in Western Australia, and he was just too young for the Second World War. And he had an ardent Christian faith like his parents. He'd also had a sibling who died as a toddler. So I think that's maybe imbued him with the sense that he had to live for two, as is often the case. Explain his drive and his self-assurance. So he recalled going to a religious conference in India in about 1952. And there he was with the other delegates, and they were being amply fed. Just outside the church gate were the most abject beggars, imploring them for their leftovers. And that really struck Bob Hawke deeply, just how pointless it was, point-scoring, quibbling over whether the Gospels mean this or that, when there are people who are dying at the church gate, and they're far more pressing real-world problems to address than hypothesizing about the epistles of St. Paul or something. So after that, he became agnostic, he said, and his main interest in life was no longer religion, it was politics. Got to do something to alleviate the suffering. A lot of it is avoidable. He applied for a Rhodes Scholarship, in case you don't know what that is. Rhodes was this British guy who in modern times would be a billionaire, made his fortune in South Africa and Zimbabwe in mining. Zambia and Zimbabwe used to be named after him, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. But anyway, when Cecil Rhodes died in 1900, probably the richest man in the world, he set up these Rhodes Scholarships for anybody from any Commonwealth country except the United Kingdom, or they're also open to Germans and Americans. So 100 a year, and it was for young men only initially, to go to Oxford University, spend 3 years there, all fees paid, and there's a stipend to live off. So it was a tremendous accolade for Bob Hawke to win this one. And so he went off to do a second degree, and he was reading Philosophy, Politics and Economics, PPE, which is the degree that so many illustrious politicians have studied. So he went to University College Oxford, because Oxford University is divided into 39 colleges. It's a federal system. I shan't explain it. But anyway, that was my college. So there it was in the 1950s. And then back in the 50s, many Australians would still have called the United Kingdom the mother country. And those with academic ambitions or theatrical ambitions often went to the United Kingdom. They felt Australia just couldn't compete. There was perhaps still that cultural cringe back then. So he was awarded his degree. He wrote some thesis about wages and incomes in Australia. And he was best known for drinking a yard of ale. There was this tradition of sconcing. I can't remember quite how it works. When I was there, they didn't have this anymore, of challenging somebody to drink 2.5 pints of beer in one go. And if you managed, it was free. If you didn't manage it, you had to pay for the contents, things like that. So he managed to do that. A yard is a measurement of distance. Some people who are only familiar with metric measurements won't know about imperial ones. So a yard is, I'm trying to think, 91 centimetres. You can get these glasses which are really thin but really long, like a yard of ale, or you can get a sconce bowl, which is huge, to hold 2.5 pints. A pint is just under half a litre. Anyway, in later life, Bob Hawke claimed that he was more renowned for that exceptional feat than he was for being Prime Minister. Then he returned to Australia, and what would one do after a PPE degree? Might become an academic, might become a barrister or a journalist or something like that. He decided to become a researcher for a trades union. People always said that he had a phenomenal intellect, but others said, well, they didn't really see it. He certainly wasn't dim. I can't remember what class of degree he got, but he perhaps didn't put it to the best use. Anyway, so he got married. He had 4 children, if memory serves. And surprisingly late, he got elected to Parliament, only in 1979, if I got that right. So only 3 years later, as leader of the Labour Party, he became Prime Minister. So it was a meteoric rise. And then he led Australia for, how long was it? Was it 8 years? So quite a long time. And he was the longest serving Prime Minister since Robert Mingus. Obviously, he's since been eclipsed by John Howard, who led the country for 11 years. And Bob Hawke was there during Australia's bicentenary. So he achieved many things as PM. There was fairly steady economic growth coming out of the difficulties of stagflation, the strikes of the 1970s. The White Australia policy was long gone, and he'd one of the people who'd advocated getting rid of it. Of course, he wasn't in Parliament at the time when Gough Whitlam did that. But Australia was starting to become a multiracial society, with starting to have a significant number of, let's say, Vietnamese Australian, Chinese Australian, Indian Australian people, and so forth. I remember the postage stamps at the time for Australia emphasised this, that Australia is a multi-ethnic and multi-religious country. He helped to make higher education more affordable from low-income families, things like that. But he faced an enemy, the redoubtable Sir Job Bjelke-Petersen, who was the Premier of Queensland, who was known for his saloon bar ultra-conservatism. And Bob Hawke thought more had to be done to be inclusive of Aborigines and so on, and people should not have any racial prejudice towards them. So yeah, the bicentenary was 200 years since the first fleet arrived, since the first British immigrants landed at Botany Bay, New South Wales, Botany Bay being now in Sydney. They called it that because, of course, there were plants people had never seen in Europe, so botany is the study of plants. And so some people will proudly tell you they're a first fleeter, as in they had an ancestor or an ancestress who arrived then in 1788. 26th of January, I think it is, that's Australia Day. So Her Majesty the Queen came out for the commemorations at Canberra and elsewhere. So it was successful that Labour managed to hold office at a federal level for so long. Remember, the Labour Party in other Commonwealth countries was in the doldrums, doing badly in New Zealand, in opposition in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. He was a stalwart to the anti-apartheid movement and attended all these Commonwealth heads of government meetings, and was adamant that South Africa must be sent to moral Coventry for its racially discriminatory policies towards the black majority. He was also Prime Minister when Iraq annexed Kuwait, and he said Australia should be part of this. The United Nations has voted that Iraq must withdraw immediately or face military action, and so Australian troops were fighting there. And I remember seeing a speech he gave about it, saying that obviously that larger countries mustn't believe they can take over smaller ones and get away with it. That would be a very dangerous principle if that was allowed to prevail. So there were some bad things happened on his watch, not his fault really. I think it was Barry McAuliffe was a young Australian who was caught smuggling drugs in Malaysia, was executed for it. There were 2 other Australians who were also hanged in Malaysia for something similar. So Bob Hawke did what he could to intercede with the Malaysian government to try and have their lives spared. Could the sentence be commuted to life imprisonment? But it wasn't to be. So Bob Hawke pointed out that if any good could come out of this tragedy, it would be to warn people, don't touch drugs. They might stay away from them. Anyway, Paul Keating was his protege, and perhaps his crown prince, and eventually, when the economy started to tank in the early 90s, Paul Keating was able to defenestrate Bob Hawke as Prime Minister. So there's a lot of backstabbing in Australian politics. It's the coup capital of the democratic world. So obviously it was a parliamentary coup. Bob Hawke was simply voted out by the Australian Labour Party. So then he had a very active retirement and wasn't reticent. He was happy to speak out on issues of public concern, and he gave us the benefit of edifying us with his opinions on all sorts of issues, such as the monarchy. He believed that it was time for Australia to dissolve the monarchy and to become a republic. And he was one of those who campaigned zealously in 1999 in that referendum for Australia to adopt a republican system of government. However, it wasn't to be, because his opponents, John Howard in other words, managed to pick holes in the Republican model, saying it was a politician's republic. So in the early 90s, it came to light that he'd had a long-standing affair with Blanche, his biographer. And so he left his wife, he divorced, he got married to Blanche. It was too late for him to have children with that woman. So he's a very rumbustious character, an everyman. His intellectualism could have been used against him, so I wonder if he hid it under a bluff exterior. He was known for his expediency. So perhaps his greatest achievement was meeting me. I remember I was in Univ JCR, that's Junior Common Room, in 2000, when the master came in, Lord Butler of Brockwell. So this is Mr. Hawke. And I paused for a second. And Lord Butler said he was Prime Minister for Australia. So I immediately went to chat to him. So that was that, and he recalled his time there, and he said, and now there are women here, and that's much better. Are people allowed to smoke in the JCR? We were allowed to smoke in the JCR in those days, but I think only in the afternoon or something like that. Anything else about Hawke? So I went to the oration he delivered to the people of Univ, and the joke he told about the missionaries being caught by the cannibals and last request and deliberately stabbing yourself with forks because then you can't make a canoe out of my hide and things like that. And he was happy to use expletives. So he definitely could connect with the common man and had a good store of crude jokes. I recall him saying that it was a pain in the neck that Australia had states, because her major changes, he had to get all the states to agree. Things were easy for New Zealand. Remember way back in the 70s, there'd been talk of New Zealand becoming a state of Australia, but in fact it did not transpire. So that was Bob Hawke. He did what he could to serve the public. I think he was in politics for the right reasons. He wasn't into grandstanding. He wasn't egomaniacal. Really, he was actuated by a wish to serve the public and to reduce unnecessary suffering, to tackle poverty. So someone I hold in quite in high regard. And, well, I hope the current Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, just having been re-elected, would take a leaf out of Hawke's book.